Hi there, and welcome back to Make Better Things with Nirvana CPH and me, Jack CGE. We loved making this series last year, so we just had to bring it back. And what better way to kick things off than with a double interview? Today, I'm at the RCA Rousing Building, where I'm going to speak to Chipp, Jansen and Lissy Hatfield from the Laboratory for Artificial Intelligence in Design. Jointly established by the Hong Kong Polytechnic University and the Royal College of Art here in London, the AiDLabs is the first program of its kind focusing on the integration of artificial intelligence and design. Chipp and Lissy both work in Intelligent Design System Innovation Project, which is exactly what we're going to be getting into today. So without any more waiting, let's meet them. Hello.
Hello.
Hi, Lissy and Chipp. Thanks so much for joining me. Today, obviously, we're going to be talking a bit about what you guys get up to here at the Rousing Building, Centre of Research and Innovation, but I would love to hear a little bit about yourselves and how you got to where you are.
I'll start. I guess I started in kind of a background in history in computer science robotics. But I spent a lot of time also kind of like working with artists and working within arts. So I have a very interdisciplinary background. How did I get here? Well, I spent some time working on a PhD on drawing robots and robotics, and that was at King's College London. And when I was finishing it up, I was looking around for postdocs, research opportunities in art and design and computer science. So actually the Material Science Research Center here was a really great opportunity to jump in, and the Laboratory for AI and Design is totally in my wheelhouse. So I'm just really excited to be working on a project that involves AI as well, working with designers and textile designers like my colleague here, Lissy.
Yeah, nice segue. Yeah. So I'm Lissy Hatfield, and I'm I guess, material researcher and originally textile designer. So I predominantly specialise in knitted textiles for my BA in Manchester, and then I did my master's here at Royal College. And during my master's, I did a lot of interdisciplinary projects, working with service designers and biologists and product design, architecture, so implementing textile knowledge and my knit practice into these projects and realising there's a lot to be said for textiles within these other realms other than fashion. And when I graduated, I joined this research side of RCA, and I think Chipp and I have a great interdisciplinary project together of kind of AI and textile knowledge.
Yeah, quite the combo,
Yeah,
quite the team. So let's get straight into it. I'd love to know about what your project is. It's the Intelligent Design System for Innovation. I've been calling it IDSI myself for short, just to make it a bit easier. But please tell us, what can we find in the Intelligent Design System for Innovation? What really is it?
I guess I could start saying it was conceived as a large proposal that our primary investigator, Professor Sharon Barley, that runs the Material Science Research Center, is putting together with colleagues to have a very kind of expansive view of, I would say, the material process or the journey of a material. So the Intelligent Design System for Innovation kind of starts from the raw materials of the raw sources of materials to how designers might kind of have tools that might use those materials, also to the consumer. So I think the consumer is also an aspect in it. And so they have this, that's the kind of broad research agenda that the center kind of is involved in it. But our project, one aspect of it is the sensory materials library.
Yeah, so what we're specialising in for the project with AiDLabs, we're looking into developing a sensory materials library, which is a vast, well, hopefully a growing and vast library where we're digitalising materials. So we're gathering their objective and subjective data of the materials and really focusing on the sensory properties of them, as well as the sustainability side. So we love to include like the supply chain and really just educate a user or designer who's sourcing materials educate them on novel or biomaterials, sustainable alternatives, and materials that they might not understand or know are the appropriate material that they should use for a certain application. The main task of the sensory materials library is really capturing designers' tacit knowledge, like textile or fashion designers' tacit knowledge. They've worked with materials for years and they really understand the qualities of a certain material and why they should use that. And if we could capture that knowledge and share that with other designers, what an impact that could have, like sustainably, just to create better things.
I love that. That's really cool. I often think of AI as so far being used in technology almost to replace labour or reduce friction in that sense, but it's very cool to kind of put the power back in the hands of the designer themselves, but still using AI. What sort of motivations pushed this project and kind of brought, obviously you mentioned yourself how much it would enable designers, but is there anything that we're seeing in the world that pushed IDSI to come to fruition?
Yeah, I think within the IDSI, the Sensorial Materials Library, I think there are a lot of material libraries. I think designers use them to, approach and understand what range of materials exist. And they have a lot of properties in them that are oftentimes very mechanical or physical or technical. The MSRC, the Material Science Research Center, has a history of research in the human experience around the materials. So I think one of the big motivations for the project was to include ways of kind of hoarding, but also trying to help understand how designers are approaching the sensory properties. And by sensory properties, I mean a material has a roughness or softness, how we perceive it, but there's also work that has been done in our lab looking at emotional properties and even well-being. So I think that's right now the research trends that are going around thinking about the human experience.
From doing interviews with designers, we've realized that the hesitation of ordering materials online as well, and I think that came to light, especially in COVID, the inaccessibility of sourcing materials. And if we could translate that quality of knowing a material from, say, an expo to a digital library, how useful that could be for the designer as well.
Bouncing off what you said about accessibility, that's for so many people that for multiple reasons might not be able to access the physicality of the materials library. It's a very inclusive and amazing project actually from that angle too. How has your project, how's it being used? What are the practical tools that you've kind of found you're pulling from it? Your loop, AI loop, is the first thing that comes to mind for me. So if you can tell me a bit about that.
Yeah, I think one of the aspects about it that we're kind of developing is having it be something that could provide a service for designers. If you go online, and a lot of designers now, you look at what material libraries exist out there, they're often taken in the form of either websites or physical libraries, right? You're going in there. And they are kind of an end, there is a tool of itself that a designer would use. But from our perspective as a kind of a product service design, we're also envisioning it as a service that you can build other tools off of. The other aspect of this, the materials library, is to have this idea of a broader range of properties that you have around the materials. So, material libraries have physical properties such as, let's say, the density or the weight of the material, but we would also want to include the human experience properties. Yeah. And there's a long history, at least in textile research, that goes back for at least 100 years into measuring properties of textiles. And our research is based upon that. In the 70s and the 80s, for example, in Japan, the Kawabata evaluation system was started or was established. And that was one where human experts, materials experts, would go and evaluate the textiles and touch them. They had scales that they would evaluate in the textiles, and this idea of what's called the textile hand was established. So that's a term that's used in textiles that describes the feel.
Right. Okay.
And so when we started by doing a similar study to kind of understand both how one would do human subjective and assessment of textile.
Being able to do the subjective assessments with participants We also, here at the lab, we've got equipment such as the fabric touch tester, which is an industry testing machine that looks, again, it tries to capture some of the subjective properties, but also bendability, heat transfer, friction.
Like surface roughness.
Roughness, smoothness. We want to match these with participants and actually from that study.
Inspired by this history of research of the textile hand, we've kind of ran our own studies. And so there's a combination of both objective measurements with our equipment as well as running a human subject analysis. So,
yeah. And I think for us, for the sensory materials library to grow, we'd love for people to almost input their own materials, their own subjective assessments of the materials. We're looking at how it could almost be a co-creation of the library. And that's a great way for scaling up the amount of materials if people putting in their own expertise of how they've used them. Like it almost becomes like a reviewing platform as well.
It does take a lot of effort to evaluate a material. So, and there's a limit to what's possible. When you run these human subject assessment studies, you have the number of materials and you also have the number of participants, and then you also have scales. So example here is a scale that we established for when we ran studies with participants. So you can see here, there is, properties like heavy to light, stiff to flexible, rough to smooth. And these are called bipolar scales in that they have two adjectives on either side. And we came up with this as a way to have the participants to go and put all of the fabrics or all the materials we were having them assess onto the same scale. You can see here, we have these little swatches and there's just 10 materials. Right. So if you think about it, one person sitting there feeling a bunch of fabrics, you only can do that before you get fatigued, right? Yeah. So there is a limit to this, right? Even though we can gather this, but it takes, half an hour, 45 minutes for them to go through this. So like Lissy was saying, our envisions with the sensory materials library and the tools we're building off of it, we're hoping to be able to scale this up by having designers contribute perhaps their own subjective assessments. Yeah. So the other thing is with subjective assessment, one would assume that if we got all of us here to go and feel 10 materials and put them on these scales, they would be like in the same area. But actually, there's quite a range of people's kind of reactions or their experiences. Materials different. My soft might be your rough. Right? Yeah. So I think a lot of the research studies are, they kind of, do a bunch of physical measurements with some machines, like how is it bending and that kind of stuff, then have a bunch of humans assess it. And then they use some statistical techniques, AI techniques, to map the two. But the truth is that, again, it's subjective, our experience of that. So I think we're also kind of looking at ways of trying to also, for example, describe materials, present them to designers and try to convey this assessment, not necessarily through that strict mapping, but through maybe other novel techniques in media. For example, video of the materials might be an attribute that you see when you come to the sensory materials library in order to understand a little bit more what that material is.
So would you be getting some sort of median range of kind of, this is people's subjective experience of this, of how rough or smooth this feels, right? Okay, cool. That's cool because you get to also see the breadth of people's experiences when it comes to these different materials.
Yeah. I don't think it's such like a pinpoint, like black and white rating. So we've been using violin plots to show like the average score, but also the tapering off of like from heavy to light, for instance. And it is, as you say, Chipp, it is so subjective. So how do you objectify something subjective? It is challenging, but I think the bigger the data, the more valuable it will be.
Yeah, we're hoping it scales, right? And, the factors of subjectivity is the range of materials that we include, right? So if I'm just showing you a bunch of linens or something, they'll all be kind of same softness, and you'll be like kind of shaving yak's hair to try to get them fit what's more soft and rough, right? But then if we include things like really rough materials in there, like sandpaper, then then the scale changes, right?
Yeah.
So that's the research, is like, how do we square an inclusive library of a lot of materials? And, objective testing, where you use machines. So for example, in our lab, we have a couple of machines that will objectively test. So they do things such as they bend the material and they measure the moment of bending, or measure heat as it goes through the material, heat transfer. Or we have a machine that does moisture management. So it sweats on the material and then it measures how the moisture is transferred through there. So again, you can kind of quantify that, but once you quantify it all, again, it's the experience that matters in there. So for us, that's one of the major research themes of what we're doing here.
It sounds like a incredibly useful tool, I think, for especially I think about Nirvana. Like, I know that for us as designers and producers, having that access to that information of how your material or product not only would perform kind of from the objective material data, but also how it might be received. Like that's incredible amount of information. How do you both envisage the materials library being used and the other projects that come from within IDSI itself?
I think for us it's about accessibility again, like how is this sensory materials library accessed? So we really see that as like an open source online website perhaps, and then we're developing a tool, AiDLabs, that will feed into, it will use the sensory materials library data and almost act as like an identification tool for materials. So for now we're in the early prototype stages. It's a tablet device app for now, and it basically works through image recognition. So the user can hold up the camera on, for now we've trained it with 10 materials, and the AiDLabs will try and recognize one of the 10 materials, and with that data sheet, like a material data card is presented, and that has things from subjective to objective data, also supply chain information, where it can be sourced. So we really see that as the sensory materials library translating this out in the wild, we say. So we've done a lot of research into designers interacting in fabric expos, and we looked at how they're recording all of this sensory data. I don't know if you've ever been to a fabric expo, but they're pretty stimulating, exhausting places. And say you go for a day or 3 days, like materials just like merge into one, or one person out of the team goes and they have to go back to the office and try and explain what material was good and how it felt, and they might get a tiny scrap or a photo on their phone, and they'll leave the expo with like hundreds of pictures. And we're looking into tailoring the AiDLabs into more of a designer's personalized library, as well as like having this data, how they can store these materials for their own digitalized material library. We're still in the kind of training stage.
For us, the image-based approach was, we noticed that, and designers go to these expos and they're all taking photos of everything. And in fact, I've gone to the Future Fabric Expo, for instance, last summer, and I just instinctively started taking photos of all these fabrics. And now I look at my album and it's just like a bunch of fabrics. And when we speak to fashion designers here, they do the same. And some are more diligent, right? For instance, they'll take the photo and they'll put little notes on it, which I think is quite noble, actually. It's quite effort to do that. So on one hand, AiDLabs, we envision it as that personal tool. The other thing is we've designed this card, or we have this card view of it. And it's not a novel thing to have a material card, but what I think is novel is to think of a standard around it, because everyone has different kinds of standards of what information is included in there. It's not that we want the industry to follow our standard, but we want to create a good standard to show what are some things that you wouldn't have included into the card. Then, how do you approach a material and then bring that card up? And that's where the image recognition comes in. So we've trained, and this I would say is probably this is the AI in this project, is using a AI model to recognize the fabric and bring up the card. And we're discovering that that's quite a challenge, because under the hood, what it's doing is doing texture recognition. So we can pull our phones out, pull a camera app up, and it'll find our faces, right? But the face has has a model that it's been trained on. Texture is kind of fascinating because it's kind of scale free. So if I zoom really into this shirt, it might look like a chunky sweater,
right,
from a further distance. So it's still within the research. It is challenging to have material recognition. Also, the world is very vivid. So we have a lot of lights on our textures and everything like that. So in other words, in order to identify many materials under different conditions, we're discovering that it's very sensitive. We have a lot of good luck with the AiDLab, or the Laboratory for Artificial Intelligence, because they get us to put the app in a place where it's put into an exhibition, right?
Oh, wow.
So we're constantly gathering participants' data. Anyone who's using AiLoop, they're actually training the model with us. So it's been really interesting to push to get the AiLoop out. We just showed at an exhibition in Hong Kong at the Mills. We showed a Fashion Cross AI exhibition in February. And that was our first push for the prototype. And then it was actually really interesting to analyze the data of the images that the exhibit, the visitors took.
Oh, wow.
Because it really showed what people want the tool to be. They were taking pictures of their clothes. They want to know what they're wearing, or what materials are around them. So it's really exciting to see their ambition and hopes for the tool, but also just on a analysis of how they behave and how they're taking the image. I think we need to put more constraints in to get that regular image.
Yeah, we have some collaborators in Hong Kong and China as well. So we have two. They're called research scholars, and they're research graduates from, I think one was from both were Hong Kong Polytechnic University, and Zheng Tao Ma and Guyan Tuo. So they are kind of experts in user experience design, UX design. They are also in AI and mobile devices. So they are helping us develop the AiLoop app.
Cool.
We have these exhibitions, and the exhibitions are a really great opportunity for us to get this iterative improvement of the app, right?
That sounds so valuable, just knowing how people use it and what they want from it, like you were saying, Lissy. I think we're in such an age of transparency, is that that's what consumers want, as well as designers and people that use and make the products. The consumer also wants a level of transparency about what they're buying. So that was really enabling for that as well, which is really, really cool.
And because it was a prototype, and actually we have great designers working on it, it looked slick, and people were like, oh, it's almost finished, right? And actually, I think this is a good thing, is maybe when you make prototypes, it's okay for them to look a little bit crusty, because it lowers the expectation of it being finished, because the model, is a trained model, but it's absolutely not 100% perfect. So we actually built in kind of an experience journey in there, where instead of saying, oh, this is is it right or wrong? We ask the user after it tries to classify it, is it right or wrong? And they select the material actually that it was supposed to classify in case it is wrong. So we're getting that kind of feedback from the app in that respect. And I think our plans for it is to have more, maybe other kinds of feedback. For example, maybe we will include something similar to this, where a designer might be at an expo and they will find an unknown material, and they might want to record their own kind of subjective experience of it.
Now, one thing that I'd love for you guys just to tell us is where the name comes from. Now also learning more about it being an image reference based one, I find it very clever, the link.
Because I did my master's here. at the RCA, and I met with the weave technician, Jane Lando, because I was like, I'm actually struggling to identify and classify woven textiles because I'm specialised in knit, and I think for a lot of people textiles is textiles, but within that you can be such a specialist or craft person within one of those fields. And she was explaining how she went to Paris and did fabric analysis, and it's a whole course where you use a loop tool, such as you probably might have seen them with like diamonds, like when people are examining diamonds, but people use them for fabric. So you look up close and it magnifies, I think, 10 or 20 times. And then with like a needle, you can count the threads and look at the structure and really identify the quality and the process of each material. And I think that it's quite crazy that I'd never done that, and I've studied textiles at BA and MA, and I think it's probably a dying skill, this fabric analysis. So we wanted to put that loop element into the project, and I think AiDLab is just like a fun way of capturing that, because it is that innovative digital tool combined with like traditional craft and skill, and like how can we preserve the craft and skill and knowledge through something like AI. And I think that's interesting with textiles, especially because, and designers and artists, they can fear AI a lot and have that fear of, is it going to replace my role, or is it going to change the landscape? But I think it's here and probably here to stay, although Chipp can talk about the AI coming and going. But I think, what's the point in fighting it? And actually, if you realise it's a tool that it's an aided tool that can help you as a practitioner and to preserve what you are about, then this is how we can work with it. So I think that's the great thing about the Sensory Materials Library and AiDLabs. It's an AI-driven design tool for designers.
Yeah. Speaking of it being used, and like you say, it's an AI tool for designers. How do you envisage the AiDLabs app being used, maybe in industry, outside of industry? What do you think the kind of different applications for it could be?
Well, you mentioned Nirvana has a materials library.
We've got a very physical materials library.
So, maybe for a small design studio, it would make a really good kind of application, right?
Yeah.
So, we envision the Sensory Materials Library as kind of an open source structure that people can use to build their own materials library. So, for example, what's the proprietary aspect that one would have? Well, it's one's own collection of materials. Also, it's like one's own, way of kind of sorting them and organizing them, right? We would kind of hope that an AI tool like AiDLabs would then allow, for example, a studio to kind of have their sensory materials library in a setting that's very specific to their own kind of design problem. So that's one vision that we see.
I think also, like, the more we look at it in the future and the more we speak to people just from a consumer point of view, identifying unknown materials, say the label's fallen off, they're sourcing materials, the designers may be sourcing materials for dead stock, where there's not much knowledge on it. So that kind of identification of unknown materials could be really useful. And I think we really hope to develop the tool into predictions as well. So not only AiDLabs referring to the sensory materials library where each material is inputted in, but maybe it could predict from its database similar materials that it has the knowledge of. It could suggest the qualities of the material just from the image. So that could be something exciting to develop. But sorry, going back to the consumer, I think it's great to have that kind of more deep personal relationship with our materials. And I think it's a rare thing to even know if what you're wearing is knitted or woven, something simple as that, or if it's synthetic or a natural fibre. I think if we know these things, we'll actually care for our materials more and they won't be so replaceable. So I think sustainable wise, it's great for the consumer.
Yeah,
as well.
absolutely. Definitely kind of encourages that relationship where there's definitely a large distance between us and the things we use.
Yeah, and it's such an intimate thing. It's like on our body, on our skin all day, and we know nothing about it. So that would be a great way to educate as well.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Another interesting use for the tool is also for materials designers. For example, we have a sister project, or it's another project within the Material Science Research Center called the Textile Circularity Center. And one big aspect in there is they're envisioning novel biomaterials, so being novel biomaterials that are based on cellulose through a fermentation process. So materials designers that might do processes like this will end up developing these novel materials, but they might not know, well, how would a consumer, how would a designer use that material? What is its properties like? So having something like an AI loop attached to the sensory materials library to identify properties, predict the properties of these novel biomaterials, they might be able to find relatable, like it's like leather, or this is how it's like leather, but maybe it's waterproof like rubber. So there is this other use there where it could enable materials designers in finding these analogs. At least this is kind of one of our hopes.
And can indicate how it might be used or performed.
Really process.
Okay.
Yeah, and there is a lot of work in using image, for example, to identify aspects of materials out there. We're not the only people doing this research. Right. Composition is a very, very, very popular thing. People want to know what's in the materials, particularly how much plastic is in our textiles, for instance. That's very valuable. Also, transparency around it. And this kind of comes back to what Lissy was saying about the consumer, right? I think our consumers are more and more interested in knowing what's actually in the clothes that we wear.
So obviously IDSI works with AI. Why don't we talk a little bit about the history you've got yourself?
I mean, I've been studying AI since I was an undergrad. The one thing that we have to remember is AI is such a broad term, and it's a paradigm. And it's a way of thinking about intelligence. It's a way of thinking about our relationships of being human and as well relationships with technology. I think the term really that was coined in the 50s. So a lot of things were AI back then. For example, using a mouse and a Windows environment at one point was like, oh, that's AI, because you're kind of working with an interface. So it's kind of a moving goalpost kind of thing. So what we're experiencing right now and this kind of fear, this rise of AI is just this way of interacting with certain types of models. And actually, if you would talk to people who are into the technology, it's a very, very narrow form of what one would consider AI, particularly this approach of a neural network, large-scale neural network trained on a large amount of data. And within there is another paradigm, what people will talk about is called machine learning. And machine learning is one in which the systems are learning kind of in ways that are analogous to how one might think of humans learning, right, adapting. However, right, it is a paradigm. So what we have within neural networks actually has been invented a long time ago. There are moments and times where people have been very excited about AI, and there's times when they haven't been excited. And within the discipline, we talk about these moments of what are called AI winters. In the 60s, everyone was really excited about neural networks, and they were thinking that, the UK government was spending a lot of money actually on developing neural networks, but actually it fell flat because computers back then was like your toaster, basically. And the amount of data we had recorded didn't exist, right? It didn't really exist in the way that it exists now with the internet. So there was a moment in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, a winter around neural networks, but it really was in through the noughties and into the teens that we really saw this explosion of these models doing useful things. Is it useful for society, or AI is useful for society? That's where I think the fear is coming from. In a lot of ways, you don't really fear AI, but you kind of fear capitalism, or at least you fear what we are going to use these things for. And in particular, because a lot of knowledge work, right, is threatened by these AI models, right? Because these are cognitive things. These are things you can talk with. They could have expert knowledge in there. And I think that's the fear that we're experiencing right now.
I think it's interesting, like coming from a designer's background and actually not knowing much about AI before joining AiDLab. And I think, as I touched on before, the kind of hesitation with textile designers and other craftspeople, that fear of losing your own skill to something that can be generated in seconds, especially for something like textiles, because traditionally it's such a slow and handcrafted practice to then have something, or painting, for instance, to then be generated in seconds. I think that doesn't sit well with people, but I think if we use it in ways where it's an AI-driven tool for designers, such as like AI Loop, I've actually warmed to the idea now, and I feel we need to just lean into it and use it to make our lives easier.
Yeah.
And of course, there needs to be probably more control and regulation on where it's used in not such great ways, in problematic ways, and we need to acknowledge the AI's bias as well.
Right.
And that's a huge thing to address. And AI is only what you feed it. If that can improve, then I think it's a bright future for AI.
I mean, two things. One thing I think about with AI is labor. In some ways, textile, fashion, or at least, people making fabrics and textiles, they might be kind of chilled out about AI because automation hit the textile industry a long time ago. In some ways, it's like, maybe that's not going to be automated as much as, for example, illustration or stock photography, right? I think that's where we're really seeing right now this kind of disruption. And so I think designers and artists are asking themselves, where do I sit in this role? Like, where am I doing it? And sometimes the answers is like, oh, you're the art director, feeding the prompt and you're crafting the prompt. But I think part of it is also maybe there is something about becoming an expert in a certain craft and suddenly seeing that craft be completely automated, that you're not going to do 3D modeling the same way anymore. Right? You might just be writing some text prompts, right? So I think it is real. I think we should acknowledge it and not be like, it's amazing and don't worry, the human's in the loop and that kind of thing, because it is going to have an effect.
Yeah.
But then we come back to labor, because I think actually there's tons of human labor involved in AI. The most recent model, the GPT-4 model, they didn't just release it out to the world. They actually spend money on hiring, thousands of people to sit there and talk to it, like literally kind of babysit it or send it to some school. And of course, the labor behind it is cheap labor. It's not happening here. It's happening overseas, taking advantage of labor markets and that kind of imbalance that we have there. So probably as we see more and more AIs being developed, we will also see more and more human labor going into that. So I don't necessarily it's going to liberate us in the ways that we think it is.
Not going to be Wall-E.
Yeah.
On a spaceship.
We could be Wall-E on a spaceship.
Yeah, that's true, actually. It really could go.
I mean, it would be cool if a robot could sort trash the way Wall-E has.
Right.
That would be helpful.
That'd be awesome.
It's poignant.
It's the next IDSI project.
But I think also, again, just touching on a labor point of view, it's also energy. Like there's this facade of AI and like digital simulation being more sustainable, especially when it comes to fashion, digital fashion. But we need to look at how like generating all of that data and the energy that comes with that, is that any better?
Yeah.
Our clothing right now at rest isn't taking energy up, but if we were to simulate this conversation, depending on how realistic you wanted to do, fabric simulation is really intensive.
So hopefully the bigger these get, the more they're used, this will be addressed. But for now, it's a lot of questions.
On the topic of improvement, we like to close things off at Nirvana CPH with technically our slogan, really.
Yeah.
Well, our slogan is make better things. So we always ask our guests, if you could make one thing better, what would it be? Lissy, let's start with you.
I don't know whether to get light-hearted or deep with this, but I think maybe just as it's fresh in my mind, I would make better. I would change people's general attitude towards textiles. and materials, because I think textiles is very undervalued, considering it literally is everywhere and arguably everything. Materials is anyway. Yeah, to really change people's value of materials. I think that would have a knock-on effect and make a better place.
Sure.
For textile people anyway.
What about yourself?
I have a total material related.
Yeah.
Oh my
On the
God.
theme.
Yeah. I mean, it's more specific to London, or more specific to me being American and being here in the UK. But I would really make the quality of bagels better, because it's just dismal for me.
Really?
The variety of bagels that you get here is not as wonderful as you may get.
Oh no.
Across the pond, and I'm just really tired of just putting cream cheese on crumpets.
I think that's not a good combination.
It just doesn't work for me.
No.
No, that doesn't work for me in concept either.
In all the holes.
Yeah.
Just sinking in.
Yeah.
So
Okay, better bagels. I like that one. That's a good one. Brick Lane would have something to say about
I'm
that.
sure
I think
I'm sure they will, and I know it's authentic. I definitely know it's authentic, but I like my big airy bagels from New York. So.
That's the one. That's a good one. Before we leave, actually, please tell any watchers and listeners where we might be able to find you, what you've got coming up, whether there's anything to keep our eyes and ears peeled for, and but specifically as well, where we can find you and follow the IDSI journey.
So if you're interested in our project, you can email us. We'd love to hear from you at sensory.materials@rca.ac.uk.
It'll be in the description.
Great.
Of the video.
And we also have an Instagram, sensory.materials as well, which we'll be putting new content on, as over the summer, we're going to be in a few more exhibitions. So we'll be promoting that. And if you'd like to come and try AI Loop, then that's the place to do it and help us train the model.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.